The gates swing open on a February morning in 1922. Smoke rises from the valley below, not factory smoke, not the gentle haze of peat fires from cottage chimneys. This is darker, thicker, the smoke of burning history. Across Ireland, mansions are going up in flames, not by accident, by design. Moore Hall in County Mayo, Summerhill in County Meath, Castle Bernard in County Cork. One by one, the great houses burn, some torched by Republican forces, some by their own owners, desperate to deny them to troops who might commandeer them, some simply abandoned, left for looters and fire. In a single decade, Ireland will lose more of its architectural heritage than any nation in Europe during peacetime. More than 400 country houses destroyed, gutted, or left to collapse. Limestone walls that stood for centuries reduced to blackened shells. Libraries holding irreplaceable manuscripts turned to ash. Art collections scattered or consumed. This is not the story of one mansion. This is the story of an entire architectural world vanishing in smoke and ruin. A world built on centuries of conquest, extraction, and division. A world that, when challenged, proved more fragile than anyone imagined. The question is not why it burned. The question is what took so long. This is 1922, the year Ireland burned its mansions, and the dark, complex story of why Irish estates fell faster than any in history. Stand at the gates of what was once Summerhill House in County Meath and try to imagine what stood here. Try to picture the longest Palladian facade in Ireland, 160 feet of cut stone, a central block flanked by curved colonnades sweeping toward pavilion wings. Inside, a hall rising 3 stories beneath a painted dome, a library holding 20,000 volumes, staterooms lined with family portraits dating back to the Norman conquest. All of it gone by 1922, burned, demolished, scattered. Summerhill was not unique. Across Ireland, from Cork to Donegal, from Galway to Wicklow, the great houses of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy faced systematic destruction. Some fell to political violence during the Irish War of Independence and Civil War. Others were torched by their own owners, unable to afford upkeep and unwilling to see them seized. Still others simply died of neglect, their roofs collapsing, their walls crumbling, their contents auctioned off to American collectors and European dealers. The numbers are staggering. Between 1919 and 1923, approximately 275 country houses were destroyed by fire or violence. Across the broader 20th century, Ireland lost more than half of its country house heritage. Over 1,500 estates, built across 3 centuries, vanished. This was not random destruction. This was the architectural manifestation of a political and social upheaval that tore Ireland apart and redrew the relationship between land, power, and memory. But to understand why Ireland's mansions burned, you have to understand what they represented, who built them, how they functioned, what they cost, and who paid the price. These were not just beautiful buildings. They were instruments of control, physical monuments to conquest and colonization. Many sat on lands seized from Irish Catholic families during plantations and confiscations dating back to the 16th century. Many were built with rents extracted from tenant farmers who had no security of tenure, no right to the land their families had worked for generations. Many served as centres of power for families who governed Ireland on behalf of the British Crown, while often living in England for much of the year. The mansions were magnificent. The system that sustained them was not. When that system finally fractured, the houses became targets, symbols of foreign rule, emblems of dispossession. In the revolutionary logic of the early 1920s, burning a big house was not vandalism. It was justice. But the story is more complicated than simple revolutionary triumph, because the destruction of Ireland's country houses did not create equality. It created absence. Where great houses once stood, there are now often only ruins, or housing estates, or nothing at all. The libraries burned. The art was sold to foreign buyers. The craftwork plasterwork by the Francini brothers, wood carving by the best Georgian artisans turned to ash, or was stripped for salvage. Ireland won independence, but it also lost a massive portion of its architectural and cultural heritage. And the people who paid the highest price were often not the landlords who fled, but the local communities who lost employment, markets, and landmarks that had shaped their geography for centuries. This is the dark, morally tangled story of 1922 and the years surrounding it. A story of revolution and retribution, of beauty and exploitation, of how political violence intersects with architecture, and of what happens when the physical symbols of power are torn down faster than anything can replace them. This is not a simple story of villains and heroes. It is a story about what Ireland built, what it inherited, what it destroyed, and what it lost in the process. The land came first, always the land, before the limestone was quarried, before the architects drew their plans, before the first foundation stone was laid. The land had to be taken. Ireland's great country houses rose on a geography of dispossession. Most of the estates that would burn in the 1920s traced their origins to 16th and 17th century plantation systematic transfers of land from Irish Catholic families to English and Scottish Protestant settlers. The Cromwellian settlement of the 1650s alone displaced thousands of Irish landowners, seizing roughly 11 million acres. By 1700, Catholics, who comprised the vast majority of Ireland's population, held less than 15% of the land. The rest belonged to a settler aristocracy that governed Ireland on behalf of the Crown and built houses to announce their permanence. The mechanism was bureaucratic and brutal. English surveyors mapped Irish holdings. Commissioners reviewed claims. Catholic landowners found their titles challenged, their loyalty questioned, their property confiscated under laws that made resistance illegal and appeals nearly impossible. Land was redistributed to English soldiers, Protestant settlers, and speculators who had backed the Crown. Former owners were displaced to marginal lands in Connacht or reduced to tenant status on estates their families had held for generations. On this stolen ground, the new landlords built. Not immediately. The 17th century was still too unstable, too contested, but by the early 1700s, confidence had arrived. The Williamite Wars were won. The Treaty of Limerick in 1691 formalized Protestant dominance. The penal laws, enacted between 1695 and 1727, systematically excluded Catholics from land ownership, political office, and legal protection. The conquest was complete. The architecture followed. The houses announced ownership in stone. Castletown House, begun in 1722 for William Connolly, Speaker of the Irish House of Commons, was the template. Palladian symmetry, a central block flanked by curved colonnades, cut stone facade. It sat on lands that had belonged to Catholic families before confiscation. Now it belonged to Connolly, whose fortune came from land speculation and money lending during the upheavals of the previous century. The house was not just a residence. It was a territorial claim made permanent. Across Ireland, the pattern repeated. Strokestown Park in County Roscommon, built for the Mann family on confiscated estates. Powerscourt in County Wicklow, expanded by the Wingfield family, whose title derived from Elizabethan plantation. Castle Cool in County Fermanagh, raised for the Earls of Belmore on lands seized during the Ulster plantation. Each house stood on ground taken by force or legal coercion. Each proclaimed that the taking was final, legitimate, and unchallengeable. The architecture itself reinforced dominance. These were not fortresses, though many retained medieval towers or incorporated older structures. They were mansions open, confident, designed to impress rather than defend. The message was clear: we are secure. We have won. This land is ours now, and we will live on it in comfort and style for generations. But land taken by force can be taken back. The houses built on conquest would one day burn for the same reason they were raised, because ownership in Ireland was never truly settled, only contested and temporarily imposed. The 18th century was the era of confidence. The Protestant ascendancy island's ruling class of landowners and their families believed they had won. The land was secure. The Catholic population was controlled through penal laws that restricted land ownership, political participation and religious practice. Rents flowed steadily from tenant farmers who had no choice but to pay, and the Anglo-Irish gentry built accordingly. Georgian Ireland produced some of the finest country houses in the British Isles. Castletown House in County Kildare, designed by Alessandro Galilei and completed in the 1720s, set the template Palladian symmetry, cut stone facades, grand interior spaces designed to impress visiting peers and reinforce social hierarchy. Powerscourt in County Wicklow, Rusborough in the same county, Carton House, Strokestown Park, Photo House in Cork. These were not merely residences. They were political statements rendered in stone and plasterwork. The scale was extraordinary. Castletown stretched over 400 feet from wing to wing. The entrance hall rose through 2 stories, lined with Italian marble. The long gallery on the upper floor ran 80 feet, its walls hung with family portraits and old masters. Rusborough, completed in 1755 for the Earl of Milltown, featured a facade of silver-grey Wicklow granite that caught light like polished metal. Inside, the Francini brothers, Italian stuccatori brought to Ireland specifically for this work, created plasterwork ceilings of astonishing delicacy, mythological scenes, garlands, figures in high relief that seemed to float above the rooms. These interiors were theatres of power. When the Earl of Kildare held gatherings at Carton House, guests moved through a sequence of rooms designed to build awe. Entrance hall to staircase to drawing rooms to state dining room. Each space grander than the last, each reinforcing the message, this family commands resources on a scale you cannot match. Silk damask on the walls, gilt mirrors reflecting candlelight, furniture by the best Dublin cabinet makers, porcelain from China, silver services weighing hundreds of pounds. The architects were often English or European, but Irish craftsmen executed the work. Stonemasons from Dublin and Cork dressed the limestone and granite. Carpenters shaped Irish oak into panelling, floors and staircases. Plasterers mixed lime and horsehair and spent months on scaffolding, hand-forming the ornamental ceilings that defined Georgian interiors. These men worked for wages that were fair by contemporary Irish standards, but modest compared to the fortunes they were helping to display. The building boom was fueled by agricultural prosperity. The 18th century saw rising grain prices and expanding export markets. Irish landlords, sitting atop efficient rent-extracting systems, enjoyed incomes that rivaled English peers. They spent accordingly, not only on houses but on landscaped parks. Castletown's park stretched across 600 acres, with woodland walks, ornamental lakes, and follies visible from the house. The wonderful barn, a corkscrew-shaped structure rising 80 feet, served as both grain storage and architectural whimsy. Dublin thrived as the second city of the British Empire. The Irish Parliament met in a purpose-built building on College Green, one of the finest neoclassical structures in Europe. Georgian squares Marian, Fitzwilliam, Mountjoy rose in orderly brick terraces. Townhouses for the ascendancy, places to winter during the social season while their country estates awaited summer returns. The wealth that built these urban palaces came from the same source as the country houses, rents extracted from tenant farmers who held no ownership, no security, and no legal recourse. The confidence was real, but it rested on assumptions that would not survive the century ahead. Walk through the reconstructed servants' quarters at any surviving Irish country house, and the same architectural truth emerges. Every grand house was 2 buildings in one. Upstairs, marble fireplaces, ornate ceilings, polished floors, libraries, drawing rooms, and ballrooms designed to dazzle. Downstairs, narrow staircases, low ceilings, stone floors, and a labyrinth of service rooms where the actual work happened. Running a major Irish estate required a small army. A house the size of Summerhill or Castle Cool employed between 30 and 60 servants. Cooks, scullery maids, housemaids, footmen, butlers, ladies' maids, grooms, gardeners, laundresses, and kitchen staff worked in shifts to maintain the illusion that wealth was effortless. They rose before dawn to light fires, heat water, prepare breakfast, and ensure that when the family and their guests woke, Everything appeared perfect. The day began in darkness. At 5 in the morning, sometimes earlier in winter, the first housemaids descended the servants' stairs. Their job was to prepare the public rooms before anyone upstairs stirred. Fireplaces had to be cleaned of yesterday's ash, grates blackened, new fires laid with kindling and coal. By the time the family came down for breakfast, fires would be burning in the drawing room, library and dining room. The work was cold, dirty, and physically demanding. Coal dust coated hands and clothes. Kneeling on stone floors for hours left knees bruised and aching. In the kitchen, the hierarchy was strict. The cook commanded. Beneath her, kitchen maids prepared vegetables, plucked poultry, and scrubbed pots. Scullery maids, the lowest rank, washed dishes in scalding water and hauled waste to the midden heaps behind the house. A formal dinner for 20 guests might require 12 courses, each precisely timed. The coordination demanded military discipline. One course delayed, one sauce broken, and the cook's reputation suffered. Mistakes meant dismissal. The butler governed the male staff. Footmen served at table, answered the door, carried messages, and attended the family during social events. They wore livery-tailored coats, white gloves, polished shoes, and were expected to remain expressionless and silent unless spoken to. The butler himself managed the wine cellar, oversaw the dining room, and served as the visible face of household order. His authority below stairs was absolute. A bad reference from a butler could end a servant's career. Ladies' maids and valets occupied a separate tier. They attended directly to the family, dressing them, maintaining their wardrobes, traveling with them when they left the estate. These positions required skill and discretion. A lady's maid knew her mistress's secrets, her moods, her indiscretions. Silence was expected. Loyalty was rewarded with better wages, private rooms, and marginally more respect. Outside, the labor was equally demanding. Grooms rose early to feed and exercise horses. Coachmen maintained carriages and harnesses. Gardeners tended the pleasure grounds, hothouses, and kitchen gardens that supplied vegetables and fruit. In grand estates like Powerscourt, the gardens alone employed a dozen men year-round. Head gardeners, respected for their horticultural knowledge, commanded wages that rivaled butlers. Undergardeners worked for far less, digging, weeding, hauling manure, and pruning in all weather. Laundresses worked in separate buildings to keep steam and odors away from the main house. Washing clothes, linens, and table settings for a large household was brutal labor. Water had to be heated over open fires. Heavy fabrics were scrubbed by hand, wrung out, hung to dry, then pressed with irons heated on stoves. A single tablecloth could take an hour to iron properly. The work destroyed hands and backs. Wages varied by position and gender. A butler at a major Irish estate might earn £60 to £80 annually in the mid-19th century. A cook earned 30 to 40. Housemaids received 12 to 20. Scullery maids, the bottom rung, made £8 to £10 a year less than many tenant farmers. All received room and board, but the rooms were cramped, unheated, and shared. Meals were plain. Privacy was non-existent. The servants knew exactly how the system worked. They saw the contrast daily. Upstairs, silk, silver, leisure. Downstairs, stone, tin, endless labor. Some accepted it as natural order. Others resented it quietly, carrying bitterness that would surface when the political winds shifted. The mansions looked self-sufficient. They were not. Every Irish country house sat atop an economic system that extracted wealth from the surrounding countryside. That system was tenant farming, and by the 19th century, it had become increasingly exploitative. Most Irish tenant farmers held no legal ownership of the land they worked. They rented from landlords, often absentee landlords who lived in England, and managed their Irish estates through agents. Rent was set not by what the land could sustainably produce, but by what the landlord needed to maintain his lifestyle. When rents rose, tenants had no recourse. When harvests failed, tenants still owed rent. Eviction was common, legal, and often brutal. The term for this practice was rack renting, charging the maximum rent the tenant could possibly bear, pushing right up against the edge of survival. Land agents, acting on behalf of absent owners, conducted the negotiations. Twice a year, tenants lined up outside the estate office to pay. Those who could not pay faced immediate consequences. First came threats, then legal notices. Then the crowbar brigade bailiffs and police arriving to physically remove families from their homes and demolish the cabins to prevent reoccupation. The numbers reveal the imbalance. A typical tenant farmer in the early 19th century might rent 20 to 30 acres. If the land was decent, he paid between £1 and £2 per acre annually. On a 30-acre holding, that meant £30 to £60 a year in rent. His income, after rent, might be £40 to £50 if the harvest was good, if prices held, if no one in the family fell ill and required a doctor. There was almost no margin for error. Meanwhile, the landlord collecting rents from dozens or hundreds of tenants accumulated thousands of pounds annually. The Earl of Fitzwilliam's Irish estates generated over £20,000 a year in the 1840s. Lord Lansdowne's holdings brought in similar figures. That income paid for London townhouses, continental travel, political careers, and the maintenance of the Irish country seat house the landlord might visit for only a few months each year. Absenteeism made the system worse. When landlords lived in England, their connection to the land was purely financial. They knew tenants as entries in ledgers, not as people. Agents were judged by one metric: how much rent they collected. Sympathetic agents who reduced rents during hard years risked dismissal. Harsh agents who maximized extraction were rewarded and promoted. Tenants had no legal protection. Unlike in England, where custom and evolving law gave tenants some security of tenure, Irish tenants held their land at the landlord's pleasure. Leases were short, often yearly. Improvements to the land, draining fields, building better cabins, planting hedgerows became landlord property the moment they were completed. If a tenant made his holding more productive, the agent often responded by raising the rent to capture the increased value. The system punished initiative and trapped families in subsistence. Evictions were not rare exceptions. They were routine tools of estate management. Between 1849 and 1854, during and immediately after the Great Famine, over 250,000 people were evicted. Some landlords cleared entire townlands, consolidating small holdings into larger grazing farms that required less labor and produced steadier returns. The human cost was invisible from the windows of the big house. This was the foundation beneath the marble floors and plasterwork ceilings. The wealth that built Powerscourt and Strokestown was not generated by wise investment or industrial innovation. It was extracted, year after year, from tenant farmers who had no alternative, no protection, and no hope of owning the land they worked. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 changed everything. Over 1 million people died. Another million emigrated. The population of Ireland, which had reached over 8 million in 1841, collapsed and would never recover to pre-famine levels. The famine did not affect all of Ireland equally. The big houses, by and large, survived. Their inhabitants ate. Their rents, where they could still be collected, continued. Some landlords provided relief soup kitchens, reduced rents, employment on estate projects. Others evicted tenants who could not pay, clearing land to convert tillage to grazing, which required less labor and produced steadier returns. The contrast between the suffering in the countryside and the continued comfort inside the mansions burned itself into Irish memory. The blight arrived in autumn of 1845. A fungal disease swept across potato fields. Within weeks, crops that looked healthy turned black and rotted. For a population dependent on potatoes as the primary source of food, the failure was catastrophic. The potato sustained Ireland's rural poor because it was efficient. A family could survive on the yield from a small plot. When the potato failed, there was nothing to fall back on. Grain still grew in Irish fields during the famine years, but it was exported to England to pay rents and debts. Ships laden with oats, wheat, and barley left Irish ports, while people starved within sight of the docks. The response from landlords varied. Some opened soup kitchens, purchased imported cornmeal, and distributed it. They reduced rents or forgave arrears. They employed tenants on make-work projects simply to provide wages. These efforts, while real, were inadequate against the scale of suffering. Other landlords saw the famine as opportunity. Tenants who could not pay rent were evicted in massive numbers. Between 1849 and 1854, over 250,000 people were legally removed from their holdings. The Mann family at Strokestown Park evicted thousands and consolidated the cleared land into grazing farms. Major Denny Mann was assassinated in 1847 by tenants who saw him as a murderer. His death shocked the ascendancy but changed nothing. Inside the big houses, life continued with eerie normalcy. Dinner parties proceeded. Hunting seasons ran their course. Estate records show routine expenditures on wine, furniture, and repairs even as tenants died along the estate roads. The moral disconnect was absolute. Some landlords went bankrupt. Rents collapsed because dead or emigrated tenants paid nothing. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849 allowed insolvent properties to be sold quickly, breaking up some of the oldest land holdings. New owners, often Irish Catholic merchants, purchased estates at fractions of their former value. The famine destroyed whatever remained of the ascendancy's moral authority. The sight of people dying while grain was exported, of evictions during starvation, of mansions untouched while entire villages disappeared, this shattered any belief that the landlord class served Ireland's interests. Irish collective memory held the image, the big house on the hill, lights in its windows, while below in the darkness, the people starved. That image would return when fire consumed those houses. By the 1870s, patience had run out. The Land War, a campaign of agrarian agitation and violence organized by groups like the Irish National Land League, targeted the landlord system directly. Tenants refused to pay rent. Boycotts isolated landlords and agents socially and economically. Violence, cattle maiming, arson, intimidation, and occasional assassination became tools of resistance. The Land War forced concessions. A series of land acts beginning in 1870 gradually gave tenants rights they had never possessed. Security of tenure, fair rent tribunals, and eventually the ability to purchase their holdings outright with government loans. By the early 20th century, the landlord class was in retreat. Many sold their estates. Others held on, but their authority had been broken. The spark was agricultural depression. In the late 1870s, American grain flooded European markets. Prices collapsed. Irish farmers, already operating on thin margins, could not afford rents set during prosperous years. Landlords refused to lower rents proportionally. Evictions increased. Anger mounted. In 1879, Michael Davitt founded the Irish National Land League. The League's demands were clear: fair rent, fixity of tenure, and free sale, the 3FS. Charles Stewart Parnell, a Protestant landlord and member of Parliament, became its president, lending political legitimacy to agrarian radicalism. The League organized tenants into collective action. Entire communities agreed to withhold rents simultaneously. Individual resistance was suicide. Mass resistance was power. The boycott became the movement's signature weapon. The term itself originated in 1880 when Captain Charles Boycott, a land agent in County Mayo, attempted to evict tenants. The community responded by isolating him completely. No one would work his fields, sell him goods, or deliver his mail. Laborers imported from Ulster to harvest his crops required military protection. The cost exceeded the value of the harvest. Boycott fled Ireland. His name entered the English language. Violence accompanied organization. Landlords and agents received threatening letters. Cattle were maimed or driven off cliffs. Hayricks burned. Shots fired through windows at night reminded estate managers their lives were at risk. Between 1879 and 1882, agrarian outrages numbered in the thousands annually. Some landlords hired armed guards. Others moved permanently to England. The British government responded with coercion and concession. The Land Act of 1881 granted the 3FS. Tenants gained legal protection against arbitrary eviction and arbitrary rent increases. Fair rent courts allowed appeals to tribunals. The act did not give ownership, but it broke the landlord's absolute control. Further acts followed. The Ashbourne Act of 1885 provided government loans, allowing tenants to purchase their holdings. The Wyndham Act of 1903 accelerated the process. By 1920, roughly two-thirds of Irish tenant farmers had become owners. The land transfer was massive and revolutionary in effect. The landlord class understood what was happening. Their authority rested on land. Once tenants became owners, the big house system lost its foundation. Some landlords sold voluntarily, others clung to reduced estates. A few adapted, becoming gentlemen farmers rather than rent collectors. But the psychological shift was irreversible. The land war proved the ascendancy could be challenged and forced to yield. That lesson carried into the next phase: political independence. The Irish War of Independence, fought between 1919 and 1921, transformed Ireland's country houses from symbols of fading power into active targets. The reasons were both strategic and symbolic. Strategically, big houses could be useful to crown forces. British troops and auxiliaries sometimes requisitioned mansions for barracks, command posts, or detention centres. The Irish Republican Army responded by burning houses to deny them to the enemy. Even houses not actively used by Crown forces were suspect. Many landlords were known loyalists. Some harboured British officers, and the estates themselves represented collaboration with British rule. Symbolically, the big house embodied everything the independence movement opposed. These were monuments to conquest, built on stolen land, sustained by exploitation. Burning one struck at the psychological foundations of British authority in Ireland. It announced that the old order was finished and that no symbol of that order was safe. The IRA issued warnings. Letters arrived at big houses across the country, typed or handwritten, informing owners that their property was under sentence. Some warnings gave explicit deadlines. Others were vague threats. A few families took them seriously and left. Most stayed either from stubbornness, disbelief, or lack of alternatives. Where would they go? These houses had been family seats for generations. The first major burning came in 1920. Summerhill House survived that year, but dozens of others did not. The pattern was consistent. IRA units arrived at night, often in groups of 10 to 20 men. They knocked on the door or simply broke in. The family was given minutes to gather essentials, documents, jewelry, perhaps a few clothes. Then the house was doused with paraffin, furniture piled as kindling, and matches struck. Some families watched from the lawn as flames consumed their homes. Others were escorted away at gunpoint. Servants, if present, were usually allowed to leave unharmed, though their livelihoods disappeared with the house. Local fire brigades, even when nearby, rarely responded. Engines were blocked, hoses cut, or firefighters simply refused to act. The burnings had community support, or at minimum, community acquiescence. British reprisals made the situation worse. Crown forces responded to IRA attacks by burning suspected Republican homes and businesses. The cycle escalated. For every big house burned by the IRA, the British burned cottages and shops. For every British reprisal, the IRA targeted another mansion. By 1921, the countryside was scarred with ruins. Not all burnings were political. Some were opportunistic. With law and order collapsing, looters moved in after IRA raids, stripping houses of anything valuable before fire finished the job. Some fires were set by former employees seeking revenge for old grievances. Some were simply arson for its own sake. The chaos of civil conflict providing cover. The War of Independence ended with the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921. But the burnings did not stop. They intensified, because now Ireland faced civil war, and the big houses stood in the crossfire. 1922 was the climax. The Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed in December 1921, created the Irish Free State but partitioned Ireland, leaving 6 counties in the north under British rule. The treaty split the independence movement. Civil war erupted between pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. In the chaos, the destruction of big houses accelerated. Anti-treaty forces burned houses as acts of war. Pro-treaty forces sometimes destroyed them to prevent occupation by the opposition. Landowners, caught between factions and terrified of being targeted, sometimes burned their own houses rather than see them seized. And in many cases there was simply no one left to protect the buildings. Families had fled, staff had dispersed, and local communities, with little attachment to symbols of dispossession, did not intervene. The statistics are brutal. In 1922 alone, at least 192 country houses were destroyed by fire or explosion. Some sources place the number higher. The destruction peaked in the spring and summer as the Civil War reached its most violent phase. Houses burned in Cork, Limerick, Tipperary, Galway, Wicklow, and Dublin. No region was spared. The logic of targeting shifted. During the War of Independence, houses burned because their owners were loyalists or because Crown forces used them. Now houses burned because they were strategic positions that one side wanted and the other wanted to deny. A big house on high ground could be fortified. Better to burn it preemptively than let the enemy control it. Moore Hall in County Mayo went up in February. The home of novelist George Moore, it stood empty. Moore lived in London. Anti-treaty forces torched it. The library containing Moore's manuscripts and correspondence was destroyed. The shell stood for decades, a roofless ruin overlooking Lough Carra, before finally collapsing. Castle Bernard in County Cork burned in June. One of the largest houses in Ireland, it belonged to the Earl of Bandon. Anti-treaty forces arrived, removed the family, and set fires on multiple floors simultaneously. The house burned for 2 days. Locals gathered to watch. Some reportedly cheered. Others wept, not for the family, but for the jobs the estate had represented. Summerhill House in Meath burned. Roxburgh House in Galway, childhood home of Lady Gregory, burned. Anne's Grove in Cork burned. House after house, each fire erasing decades or centuries of accumulated history. The Free State government condemned the burnings. They recognized that Ireland was destroying its own heritage. But condemnation meant little without enforcement, and enforcement required military control the government did not yet have. Anti-treaty forces controlled significant territory and operated with local support. Some families fought back. Armed guards patrolled estates. Barbed wire went up. A few houses were sandbagged and turned into fortresses. But defense required resources most families no longer had. The staff had left. Money was tight. The will to fight for a house, when the entire social system it represented was collapsing, was limited. By year's end, the landscape had been transformed. Across Ireland, blackened ruins stood where great houses had been. Stone walls with empty windows, collapsed roofs. The architectural heritage of 3 centuries was reduced to rubble and ash. Summerhill House in County Meath burned in March 1922. It was one of the finest Palladian houses in Ireland, designed by the architect Sir Edward Lovett Pearce in the 1730s for the Langford family. 160 feet of classical perfection. A central block with curved colonnades, a dome rising over the entrance hall. Interiors by the Francini brothers, the Italian stuccatori whose plasterwork defined Irish Georgian style. Anti-treaty forces torched it. The family had already fled. The house burned for days. When the flames died, only the outer walls remained. Photographs from the aftermath show blackened stone, collapsed floors, the dome caved in. Looters picked through the ruins for salvageable materials. The shell stood for decades until it was finally demolished in the 1950s. Moore Hall burned in February 1922. The house sat on the shore of Lough Carra in County Mayo, built in 1795 for the Moore family. George Moore, the novelist and playwright, had grown up there. By 1922, he lived permanently in London, and the house stood empty except for a caretaker. Anti-treaty forces suspected it might be used by Free State troops. They arrived at night, removed the caretaker, and set the fires. The library went first. Moore's manuscripts, letters, and personal papers turned to ash. Family portraits blistered and fell from walls. The roof collapsed inward. The stone walls survived, but everything inside was consumed. Moore never returned to see the ruin. He died in 1933. The shell remains today, roofless and skeletal, preserved as a national monument. Castle Bernard in County Cork was immense. Built for the Earls of Bandon, it sprawled across multiple wings and courtyards. The interiors held one of Ireland's finest private art collections. The library contained rare books and manuscripts dating to the 16th century. On June 21, 1922, anti-treaty forces arrived in force. They gave the family 30 minutes to evacuate. The Countess of Bandon reportedly tried to negotiate, offering to open the house as a hospital. The request was refused. Paraffin was poured. Fires were lit strategically to ensure total destruction. The house burned for 2 days. Neighbors came from miles to watch. The heat was so intense that windows in nearby buildings cracked. When it was over, only fragments of wall remained. The art collection was entirely destroyed. The library was ash. Salvagers descended within days, pulling lead from roof remnants, stripping usable stone, carting away anything that could be sold. Roxborough House in Galway burned in January 1923. It belonged to the Gregory family. Lady Augusta Gregory, co-founder of the Abbey Theatre, had spent her childhood there. She was in Dublin when word came. By the time she could return, the house was gone. Her diaries record the grief plainly, not just for the building but for family history, and irreplaceable letters erased. These were not isolated incidents. Each burning followed the same pattern: warning or no warning, evacuation, fire, ruin. Each erased not just a building but entire collections and histories that could never be reconstructed. What happens after a country house burns? Sometimes nothing. The ruin stands, slowly collapsing, reclaimed by ivy and weather. Sometimes salvage crews move in, stripping lead from roofs, timber from floors, stone from walls. Sometimes the site is cleared entirely, erased. Across Ireland, the pattern repeated. Burned houses became ruins. Ruins became salvage yards. Salvage disappeared into anonymous reused stones in farm walls, timber in sheds, lead melted down and sold. What could not be salvaged was often sold before the fires. Libraries were auctioned. Art collections went to dealers in London and New York. Furniture, silver, and family archives scattered to the winds. The salvage economy was immediate and ruthless. Within days of a house burning, local men arrived with carts and tools. Lead sheeting from roofs was valuable. It could be melted and resold. Oak beams, if not too charred, were repurposed as barn timbers. Cut stone blocks went into walls and foundations. Copper piping, brass fixtures, iron gates, anything metal had scrap value. In some cases, salvage was organized by the families themselves. Facing total loss, owners hired crews to extract what remained before weather, and vandals finished the job. In other cases, salvage was theft. Looters moved through ruins at night, prying out fixtures, smashing walls to reach copper wire, hauling away carved mantels and stair rails. The architectural loss was staggering, but the cultural loss cut deeper. Irish country houses held centuries of accumulated art, books, manuscripts, and family papers. When the houses burned, these collections often burned with them. What survived was usually sold quickly. Families fleeing Ireland or facing financial ruin auctioned their remaining possessions to raise cash. The buyers were predominantly foreign. American collectors, newly wealthy and hungry for European culture, purchased Irish art and furniture in bulk. London dealers bought entire library collections. Auction houses in Dublin and London handled estate sales weekly through the 1920s and 1930s. Portraits of Irish families now hang in American museums. Rare books from Irish libraries sit in university collections in the United States and Britain. Georgian silver and furniture fill private collections worldwide. Some losses were irreplaceable. Family papers documenting centuries of estate management and local history went up in flames or were discarded as worthless. Manuscripts by Irish writers stored in family libraries were destroyed. Architectural drawings and estate maps that would have been invaluable to historians vanished. The erasure was not just physical but archival. A few families managed to save key items. Advance warnings gave time to pack paintings, documents, and heirlooms. Some items were hidden with trusted staff or neighbors. Others were smuggled to England before burnings, but these were exceptions. The Irish government made limited efforts to document what remained. The National Museum acquired some salvaged architectural elements. Historians photographed ruins before they collapsed, but resources were scarce. The new Free State faced massive challenges. Preserving the architectural heritage of the old ascendancy was not a priority. By 1930, Ireland had won independence, but lost a significant portion of its built heritage. The country houses that survived did so by luck or adaptation. The rest were gone. The standard narrative of the big house burning centers on landlords and revolutionaries. Owners fleeing in terror, Republicans striking symbolic blows against British rule. What that narrative often omits is the perspective of the people who lived and worked in and around these estates, the servants, tenant farmers, and local laborers whose lives were most directly shaped by the houses and most immediately disrupted by their destruction. The truth is that local communities had deeply mixed feelings. For some, the burning of a big house was justice, the end of centuries of exploitation and dispossession. For others, it was a tragedy: jobs lost, a local landmark erased, a source of wages and markets gone. Many estate workers depended on the big house for their livelihoods. When the house burned, they lost employment, often with no immediate alternative. Surviving testimonies from servants reveal ambivalence. A housemaid interviewed decades later about the burning of her employer's estate recalled watching the flames with mixed emotions. She had worked there for 12 years. The wages were fair, the family not cruel. But she also remembered her mother's stories of evictions, of relatives forced off land during the famine. The house represented both her livelihood and her family's oppression. When it burned, she felt loss and relief simultaneously. Tenant farmers, many of whom had recently gained ownership through land acts, generally did not mourn the big houses. The buildings symbolized the system that had exploited them for generations. Yet even among former tenants, reactions varied. Older men who remembered the famine spoke approvingly of the burnings. Younger farmers who had purchased their holdings legally and now operated as independent owners sometimes expressed regret. The violence felt excessive, the destruction wasteful. Local tradesmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, shopkeepers lost customers when estates collapsed. Big houses generated economic activity beyond direct employment. They purchased supplies, hired contractors for repairs, and brought visitors who spent money locally. When a house burned, surrounding villages felt the economic contraction immediately. Shops saw fewer customers. Craftsmen lost steady work. The pub that had served estate staff on their evenings off stood emptier. Some estate workers actively participated in the burnings. Grooms who had tended horses for years joined IRA units that torched their former employers' homes. Gardeners who had maintained pleasure grounds guided Republican forces through estate layouts, pointing out where valuables were stored and how to spread fires most effectively. These men had intimate knowledge of the houses and scores to settle wages withheld, dismissals for minor infractions, decades of condescension and insult. Others tried to save the houses. At several estates, former staff formed bucket brigades or alerted fire brigades despite threats. A butler at one Wicklow estate stood in front of the door and refused to let IRA forces enter. They pushed past him, but he followed them through the house, arguing and pleading until they physically removed him. The house burned anyway. Local clergy often opposed the burnings publicly while privately sympathizing with the impulse. Catholic priests condemned violence from the pulpit but understood the anger behind it. Protestant ministers, whose congregations included the landlord families, found themselves isolated. Their parishioners were fleeing or living in fear. Their churches, often located near big houses, sometimes became targets themselves. What emerges from these fragmented voices is complexity. The burnings were not simple acts of revolutionary justice embraced unanimously by the oppressed. They were divisive, destructive events that tore through communities, forcing people to choose sides or watch helplessly as familiar landscapes were erased. Ireland today is a country haunted by architectural absence. Where hundreds of country houses once stood, there are often only photographs, watercolors, and estate maps. The National Inventory of Architectural Heritage lists over 1,500 Irish country houses lost in the 20th century. Most burned or were demolished between 1919 and 1960. What survived did so through luck, location, or determined preservation. Some houses, like Castletown or Rusborough, were eventually taken over by state bodies or conservation trusts. Others remain in private hands, maintained by descendants of the original families or by new owners who purchased them as restoration projects. A few were converted into hotels, schools, or government offices, but survival was the exception, not the rule. Castletown House survived because it was sold early. In 1967, Desmond Guinness founded the Irish Georgian Society specifically to save it from demolition. The house became a model for preservation restored, opened to the public, and eventually transferred to state care. Today, it operates as a museum and educational site, its Francini plasterwork intact, its importance recognized nationally. Rusborough House survived because the Bate family, who purchased it in 1952, invested heavily in its maintenance and filled it with one of Europe's finest private art collections. The house became a destination, attracting visitors who came for the art and stayed for the architecture. It too eventually passed into trust management. Other houses survived through adaptation. Carton House became a hotel. Kilcare Castle became a resort. Birr Castle remains with the Parsons family, who opened the domain and gardens to the public while maintaining the house as a private residence. These adaptations required compromise modern amenities inserted into historic structures, public access, where once there was exclusivity, but they kept the buildings alive. Many houses were not so fortunate. Where Summerhill once stood, there is now a housing estate. Moore Hall remains a roofless ruin, picturesque but unusable. Dozens of other sites hold nothing but foundations, visible only as rectangular depressions in fields. The destruction of 1922 created voids in the landscape that have never been filled. The cultural loss is harder to quantify but no less real. The libraries that burned contained irreplaceable manuscripts, rare books, and family archives that documented centuries of Irish life. The art collections dispersed to foreign buyers included works by Irish artists that would have formed the nucleus of a national collection. The architectural craftsmanship, plasterwork, wood carving, stonework represented skills passed down through generations, now visible only in surviving fragments. Contemporary Ireland grapples with this legacy. The big houses symbolize oppression, conquest, and exploitation. Yet they also represent architectural achievement, craftsmanship, and a layer of Irish history that cannot be ignored. Preservationists argue that the houses belong to everyone now, that their origins do not negate their cultural value. Critics counter that resources spent preserving symbols of colonialism might be better directed elsewhere. The debate is unresolved. What is clear is that Ireland lost architectural heritage at a pace and scale almost unmatched in peacetime Europe. The fires of 1922 erased in months what had taken centuries to build. The question facing Ireland today is not whether that loss was justified. History does not reverse, but what lessons it offers. Buildings are not neutral. They carry meaning assigned by those who built them and those who live among them. When those meanings conflict, when a structure embodies both beauty and oppression, preservation becomes a moral question as much as an architectural one. Ireland made its choice in 1922. The country is still living with the consequences, still deciding what those empty landscapes and surviving ruins mean for a nation trying to honor its past without being trapped by it.